Please welcome to the podium Dr. Stan Deaton.
Thank you, Todd. Great to see you all again. Thanks to my colleagues for coming out. Sophia, great job. These are wonderful people to work with, as you can imagine. It's great fun to come to work every day. And a little while ago, Judge Abbott said to me, "This is the largest crowd we've had in August." And I said, "It's about to be the sleepiest crowd that you've had in August." You mentioned World War I, or the Great War as I'll refer to it, and most of the time people's eyes glaze over. I hope that doesn't happen. And I'm going to go through this quickly. A lot of stuff to throw at you. Starting on a Friday, October 6th, 1916, a woman named Rose Reeder, R-E-A-D-E-R, you're going to hear that last name once or twice, Rose Reeder received a telegram at her home in England. Her son Alec had gone to war in August 1915, 4 months before his 18th birthday. He was 17. On September 15th, 1916, 3 weeks before she received the telegram, Alec had been stationed at High Wood on the Somme, the river in the northeastern part of France. He was part of the zero-hour attack that Friday morning at 6:20 a.m. And like 80% of his colleagues that day, his comrades, Alec was killed. Just one of 400,000 total British casualties in the Battle of the Somme. That's the first of many statistics I'm going to throw at you because I don't think you begin to understand the magnitude, the carnage of that conflict without numbers. The Somme lasted from July to November in 1916. Alec's body was recovered and given a proper burial. He was one of 37 million casualties in that war. As someone said, that many casualties is a statistic. One death is a tragedy. Rose Reeder was never the same after the death of her boy. She no doubt echoed the words of former British Prime Minister Harold Asquith, who also lost his son in the war, when he said, "Whatever pride I had in the past, whatever hope I had in the far future, by much the larger part of both was invested in him. Now all that is gone." Of Alec Reeder's officers that September day, only 2 remained alive and unwounded, and between them they wrote 380 letters of condolences to families of the killed, wounded, or missing from that one action on that one day of a campaign that lasted 4 months in a war that lasted 4 long years. Rose Reeder wanted more than bare platitudes, however. She wanted to know what happened to her son. Like many other grieving parents, she wrote pleading letters to the authorities, begging for more information about his death and his burial, and particularly the site of his grave. On December 1st, she wrote to the War Office asking for details about the site of his grave. After the war, she hoped at least to be able to visit the battlefield where he had fallen, visit his grave, to say goodbye. She got a perfunctory letter back. This went on for some time. She got his last paycheck, which was absolutely insulting. On July 5th, 9 months after she first received news of his death, she wrote again, and imagine her horror on receiving this response, quote, "I am much afraid that heavy shelling may have obliterated all traces of his grave." They didn't know where it was. In 1928, on the 10th anniversary of the end of the war, Rose Reeder and her surviving children made a pilgrimage to the battlefields. She stood at High Wood, quiet now, no barbed wire, no shelling, no gas. She visited the nearby cemetery, hoping against hope she would see Alec's name on one of the graves. She visited the Meningate Memorial, a war memorial in Ypres, Belgium, dedicated to the British and Commonwealth soldiers who were killed in the Ypres salient, not just killed, but whose graves are unknown. Remember that, unknown. There are almost 55,000 names on that memorial. She looked, couldn't find Alex's name anywhere. She stood at the nightly ritual as a bugler played the last post as the sun set, which still happens every night. It will happen tonight at 8 o'clock. Then she and her children returned home. 10 years later, in 1938, she returned to France for the last time and once again searched in vain for Alec's name on any memorial, let alone finding his final resting place. Never saw it, never found it. Went to her own grave in 1954, never knowing where he was buried, convinced that his sacrifice had been forgotten by his country and hers, all the suffering that she'd done. One day, in the late 1980s, more than 70 years after Alec's death, on that September morning, two of Rose Reeder's grandsons were visiting the Thiepval Memorial to the Missing of the Somme, 2 miles from High Wood, completed in 1932. There they discovered, on pier and face 13C, the name Bertram Alec Reeder, one of 73,000 soldiers killed just in that part of the Somme alone who have no known grave. To give you some perspective, as of February this year, the total missing in action in Vietnam stood at 1,643. 73,000 in that part of the Somme alone. They don't know where they are. The grief and pain caused by that war never left Alex Reeder's family. His mother carried her anguish to her grave, and the wound of her grief lived on in her surviving children and grandchildren. Multiply that grief out by millions and millions and millions across 100 years, and you have some idea of the scars left by that conflict, both on individual human psyche and on our society. What was Alex Reeder doing in France in 1916 in the first place? This is the part of the history lesson where eyes glaze over. It's a convoluted story and usually sends most people running to the exits in history class. I owe you some explanation. We owe him some small explanation. I won't belabor it, but stay with me here. See if you can follow the logic in this and see if there is any in it. Here it is, very quickly. A 19-year-old Serbian named Gavrilo Princip fired 2 shots at 10:34 in the morning on June 28, 1914, in front of Schiller's Delicatessen in the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo, killing a 50-year-old man, Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. We don't even know what the Austro-Hungarian throne is anymore. But this was important. He was killed because he represented that empire, and nationalist Serbs wanted to liberate the southern Slavs who lived in that empire. Now, then as now, when an international incident like this occurs, testosterone ran high. As one historian said, mustaches moistened and horses snorted. Then as now, people said, somebody should do something. We can't just stand here and take this. Somebody should do something. Well, what should we do? I don't know, but it should have some muscle behind it. Military alliances mixed with age-old mistrust and ethnic hatreds created a deadly cocktail and a diplomatic disaster. And this went on for about a month. Austria-Hungary saw his murder not as an act of a crime, but as an act of terror. This was a chance to humiliate Serbia, and they issued a series of very degrading ultimatums. Serbia, to its credit or not, depending on where you stood, accepted all but 2 of these. Austria-Hungary wasn't satisfied. They declared war, and Russia, Serbia's ally, began mobilizing against Serbia's destruction. Germany, by this point, tried to talk its ally, Austria-Hungary, down off the ledge. Didn't want to go to war over this, feeling the Serbs had caved on all the important points. But now Germany was caught in the middle, seemingly unable to halt the madness that had been put in place because of the death of one man. On July 31st, Germany sent ultimatums demanding that Russia stop its mobilization, its movement of 1 million troops toward the German border. It also asked France to stay out of the conflict that was coming between Russia and Germany. Russia and France, of course, both ignored these ultimatums. And on August 1st, Germany declared war against Russia and then against France. German troops marched toward Paris, not for the first time, or not for the last time, I should say, first through Luxembourg, and then they asked Belgium if they could violate Belgium's neutrality by marching through Belgium. Belgium, of course, said no. The next day, they marched in anyway, and here the Brits come in, not because they're allied with anybody, but because they had been pledged to uphold Belgium neutrality. So Alec Reeder and all of his comrades are standing in trenches in northern France because Belgium neutrality had been violated. He and all the rest must have wondered, as soldiers have since time eternal, what in the hell am I doing here? What are we doing here? Now, the war is too vast to talk about its entirety, but I want to concentrate on 2 places that symbolize the carnage and futility and tragedy of the Great War. The Somme in 1916 and Passchendaele, or Ypres, or Flanders in 1917. Most people today, particularly before the centennial commemoration this year, brought the war back into the news, know very little about the Great War and can care less. If we know anything, it's a vague memory of some grainy black and white photographs of people dressed in funny uniforms, huddled in miserable trenches. I'll wager that most Americans my age and slightly older know about the First World War because they learned it from Snoopy. Because Charles Schulz, in a moment of brilliance, had this character, this enduring, lovable character, have an interest in World War I. The generation that fought that war has never been called the greatest generation. They did not come home to a hero's welcome. By and large, those who managed to survive were often wounded, crippled, blinded, mentally unhinged by shell shock or combat fatigue or just war weariness. Those veterans were not the subject of documentaries or Steven Spielberg movies or miniseries, no Tom Brokaw books. There was no GI Bill for the American vets. In fact, when American veterans of that war finally asked the government to do something for them in the early 1930s in what became known as the Bonus Army March on Washington, the very military they had served in was turned against them. The conflagration of World War II left them all but forgotten, and so they remain. The sheer numbers of dead and injured in that war are staggering to contemplate now. By 1914, man had learned to kill his fellow man in horrific ways, and the leaders and commanders of those armies were unimaginably stupid in wasting their lives for a few yards of ground. Trained years before in a different kind of war, they were seemingly incapable of adapting to the modern battlefield, and their decisions seem almost criminal to us now. Men died from machine guns, new lethal artillery, poison gas, tanks, flamethrowers, bombs dropped from airplanes, and yet men were repeatedly sent walking directly into these weapons, massed frontal assaults on fortified positions, defended by machine guns, barbed wire, poison gas, with predictable results, as if courage and elan could somehow save you from murderous gunfire. It was carnage on a hitherto unimaginable scale. The numbers defy understanding. If you walk along the battlefield at Ypres today, every step you take cost 35 lives in 1917. Until the Great War, the bloodiest campaign in history had been Napoleon's campaign in Russia. That had cost 400,000 lives total. 200,000 fewer than were killed at the Battle of the Somme alone. Half the number killed at Verdun. In total, the British and Empire soldiers killed numbered nearly 1.1 million in those 4 years, half of those MIA. The psychological trauma faced by the survivors was unimaginable. The monthly average of British casualties steadily increased during the war. These are monthly averages. Think about how many people we lost in Iraq and Afghanistan, about 6,500, and it's not meant to minimize those, but to put them in perspective. These are monthly averages. It started out in 1915 for the British, 19,000 casualties a month. By 1918, that number had risen to 75,000 casualties a month. British losses were modest, of course, compared to those of France, Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. March 21st, 1918 was the deadliest day in the entire war. 78,000 casualties on that one day alone. 2 million German soldiers killed in the war, leaving 500,000 widows and 1 million fatherless children in Germany in 1918. You begin to understand the next 20 years now a little bit better, don't you? There were a total of 10 million deaths in that war, 20 million wounded, another 7 to 12 million civilian deaths. So you've got a total of anywhere from 37 to 42 million casualties. How can they be so irrelevant to us now? What meaning does that war have in our lives now? And it must have some meaning, right? How do you have that many casualties, that many deaths, and it not mean anything to us? The war essentially lasted 4 years because the Germans invaded France, and the French and the British couldn't drive them out. That's it in a nutshell. There was an initial flurry of mobile activity in 1914, and then the war settled down into a trench warfare stalemate we all have heard about, a war of attrition with massive casualties, massive bloodletting. For the Germans, their strategy was really not to do anything, not to advance, not to retreat, but to simply sit there and let the French and British throw themselves, to kill as many as possible and hopefully force them to the negotiating table. The French, of course, were happy to oblige, led by Marshal Joseph Joffre. In 1914, the French suffered 454,000 battlefield deaths, not just casualties, deaths. 4 months in the fall and summer of 1914, the French lost as many men on the battlefield as the American army lost in the entire 20th century. It changed nothing. French generals still insisted on head-on, massive assaults the following year. In February 1915, the French attacked at Champagne. A mile gained, 50,000 soldiers killed. At Artois, a few months later, they did the same thing. A couple of miles gained, 102,000 French soldiers killed in 40 days. The injured and maimed numbered 3 or 4 times that. As one historian wrote, the extent of the carnage, let alone its horror, is nauseating to contemplate. In the fall of 1915, French General Joffre ordered repeated assaults in exactly the same places where his tactics had proved so murderous in the spring. Also in Artois, the British attacked to the north of the French positions and lost 60,000 killed or wounded. At the town of Loos, German machine gunners had a wide open field as masses of men were ordered to walk toward them over the plain. Of 10,000 sent over the top on the second day, fewer than 2,000 survived. The Germans, on their own initiative at one point, quit firing so that the wounded British soldiers could crawl back into their lines. You probably never heard any of this because it all pales in comparison to what came in 1916 and 17 at the Somme and at Ypres. And command incompetence escalated as well. Just talking about what happened along the Somme River, where Alec Reeder was killed in 1916 and in Passchendaele, or Ypres the next year, still evokes anger. The Germans were securely entrenched and strategically located when the British and French launched their frontal attack on a 21-mile front north of the river. Before they sent the men over the top, they launched an unprecedented artillery bombardment on the Germans, which they assured their soldiers would take care of the Germans. But of course, the Germans were dug in deep. For those Germans living through this week-long bombardment, it was living hell. A soldier who suffered through the bombardment at Verdun said later that by day 9, every single soldier was crying. When the shells subsided for an instant, the air was filled with the buzzing of millions of flies who were eating the dead and the terrifying high-pitched screams of the rats, who often grew so big and so bloated from feeding on the dead that it was said they would attack and eat a wounded man if he couldn't defend himself. It brought catatonic depression, shell shock, madness. And those are just the people waiting for the attackers. The attack came on Saturday, July 1st, 1916. It is still, to this day, the day of the biggest military fiasco in British history. 7:30 that morning, Field Marshal Douglas Haig, you'll hear his name again, the commander of the British Expeditionary Force, ordered his men over the top at the Somme. Within a matter of hours, 21,000 British soldiers were killed, 40,000 wounded, most of them within sight of their own trenches. As one historian wrote, no fighting force on the Western Front would ever lose so many so quickly for so little. By noon, 60,000 men lay dying, wounded, or dead. The Germans said they didn't even have to aim. They just had to pull the trigger and hold it down. The 1st Newfoundland Battalion lost 91% of its men within 40 minutes, which is why, to this day, July 1st is Memorial Day in Newfoundland and Labrador. After that day, the Somme offensive deteriorated into a battle of attrition. In October, torrential rains, which is the other part of this story, turned the battlefield into an impassable sea of mud, and by November, the Allies had advanced only 5 miles. You can go today. The memorial at Thiepval is a massive official British response to this disaster, and nowhere on the memorial is there any accountability for what happened. Estimates are that between July and November 1916, there were 1.3 million Allied and German casualties in that one spot. Among the British losses, 73,000 were never recovered or identified, including Alec Reeder. The Somme became a metaphor for futile and indiscriminate slaughter. What happened at Passchendaele the next year was even worse. 1917 dawned, and the strategists of French, British, and German general staffs had managed to kill 1 million men in 9 months, and the front had not moved. So, of course, they decided to do exactly the same thing again. For the Brits, Douglas Haig was the common factor at both the Somme and at Ypres. He was the one who had committed great numbers of men to an unsuccessful offensive. The next year, when the French decided, hey, the Americans are in this war, we're going to sit and wait for them, Haig would have none of that. He decided the Brits would attack the Germans alone. in Belgian Flanders. The result was what is called the Third Battle of Ypres, the Passchendaele Campaign. Now, on the Western Front, rain was always a problem. In northern France, in one period of 137 days, between October of 1914 and March 1915, there were only 18 days it didn't rain, out of 137. You can imagine the misery of millions of men living in muddy and cold trenches. It can only be imagined. At Passchendaele, an army was forced by its own generals to drown in the mud. British forces were supposed to attack the German lines and advance more than 25 miles across open ground, because again, they were going to be artillery bombardment, capture 2 North Sea ports, absolutely vital important. 3 years of trench warfare had taught Douglas Haig nothing. In 1916, more than 1 million men had died at Verdun and on the Somme, and the ground gained by either side proved negligible. Yet Haig had these grandiose visions of men and horses racing across the battlefield, as if the machine gun had never been invented. One historian, I think rightly, calls him a dangerously stupid man. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George received promises from Haig that if casualty rates climbed too high, he would call the whole thing off. It never happened. On July 24, 1917, the British lined up their artillery, thousands of guns, along a 15-mile front, one every 6 yards, and sent a solid, unrelenting rain of steel onto the Germans that lasted a week. 4.2 million shells, 107,000 tons of metal, all of which hit the ground. The earth became sodden, the subterranean water rose to the surface, and the torrential rains began to fall on top of it. 5:27 a.m. on a Monday morning, July 31st, 1917, 120,000 British troops left their trenches and tried to cross this muddy landscape in the face of unrelenting machine gun fire. The Germans had been dug in and had been virtually untouched. Haig's plan called for an advance of 5 miles a day with minimum casualties. By the end of day 2, the Brits had advanced a half a mile and had lost 35,000 killed or wounded. Haig was urged to call the whole thing off, attack elsewhere, anything. Nothing doing. He instead ordered in fresh troops. Throughout August, he launched new attacks. Another mile gained, another 40,000 men lost. Lloyd George raged in London to no avail. Haig was a friend of the King's. He planned another massive attack. September 20th, the Brits went over the top again, 900 yards gained, 22,000 men lost. 6 days later, another attack, 1,000 yards gained, 17,000 lost. October 4th, 700 yards, 26,000 casualties. Can you imagine? The land was a glutinous, massive mud bog with rain pouring down, ground so soupy it took an hour to walk 400 yards if nobody was shooting at you. 200,000 casualties at that point for no reason, nothing to show for it. The worst was yet to come. Rain lashing down, the army covered in mud. Infection was rampant. Men were cracking under the strain. Everything got stuck in the mud. Boots were torn off feet. Men and horses sucked down to their deaths. Some were trapped and couldn't even be pulled out. Arms and legs were broken when they tried to pull them out. Some men were shot like animals simply to put them out of their misery because they couldn't get them out of the mud. Haig, undeterred, said that Passchendaele was too important to leave in German hands. Forget about the North Sea ports. They could just take the heights of Passchendaele. That'd be enough. Haig ordered another attack on October 9th. Again, thousands over the top, thousands of deaths, thousands stuck in no man's land, drowning, crying, left to a horrible fate. And even after that day, Haig refused to give up. He ordered repeated attacks throughout October. First the British, then he sent in the Australians, and then the New Zealanders, who lost 13,000 soldiers in one morning. The line inched forward. Rains came down. The stench became unbearable. Men simply disappeared in the mud. Many of them are still there today. On November 6, 1917, the Canadians finally entered the obliterated village of Passchendaele, the supposedly all-important position for which the British had lost 325,000 soldiers, later ordered abandoned by Haig as being too exposed. These are the people that the British had entrusted their sons. To give you some comparison, again, between 2003 and 2012, the total number of U.S. service members killed in Iraq, 4,486. In comparison. This is why one German general said the British soldiers were lions led by donkeys. At Passchendaele in 1917, 3 years into the war, Haig had ordered repeated frontal assaults against fortified positions, devoid of surprise, in the rain and mud, after Verdun, after the Somme, after everything that had come before. And at war's end, he was made a peer, given 100,000 pounds, and you can still see his statue in Whitehall. His men called him the Butcher. A little-known fact, the criminal slaughter continued until the very last second. We all know the war ended on November 11th, 1918. The Germans signed the ultimatum at 5 o'clock that morning, and the commander said, "We will attack until the final second," till 11 a.m. News spread through the ranks that morning, setting off wild celebrations that the war would end, but not till 11 o'clock. Celebrations ended abruptly when Americans realized, or when all the troops realized, that armistice or no, the attacks would go on that morning. 9 of the 16 U.S. divisions on the Western Front moved forward and attacked that morning. By the time the guns fell silent at 11 a.m., there were 11,000 more casualties, more men than who fell on D-Day in World War II. Never had there been such needless slaughter. How do you explain to the wives and parents and children about the lives sacrificed on that day? So the war came to an end. Destroyed the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. Introduced chemical weapons, tanks, airborne bombing. Brought millions of women into the workforce, hastening their legal right to vote. Gave independence to nations like the Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic countries. Created new nations in the Middle East with arbitrary borders. Brought about major cultural changes, including a new understanding of the psychology of war, of shell shock, post-traumatic stress. Launched the Russian Revolution. For the French, it was the good war. They fought the German invader. The next war, of course, would bring shame and collaboration for the French. For the Germans, the loss was incalculable and almost incomprehensible defeat, laying the groundwork for economic collapse, revolution, fascism, and genocide. Imagine we're standing on a field, looking back, flat field, and humps or mountains in the field represent great historical events of the past century. As we look backward from this vantage point, we see the rise of the internet and the computer. We see the end of the Cold War, Watergate, Vietnam, the 60s, the Civil Rights Movement, the largest of all, of course, World War II. You can't even see beyond it. You have to go out there to it and stand on top of it to see beyond it. And when you do, you see fascism, FDR, the New Deal, the Russian Revolution, the First World War. I ask you, what if Princeps' bullet had missed the Archduke? What if he hadn't been killed? Or what if the leaders of the Allied and Central Powers had all reacted differently and there'd been no war? Because make no mistake, that war could have been avoided. What if it had? What if there'd been no Great War? And you think, I'd have these 25 minutes of my life back. I wouldn't have to listen to you talk about it. Well, follow along here with me as we journey now through the rest of the 20th century had there been no Great War. First of all, there would have been no Russian Revolution, thus no communist Soviet Union. Without the First World War, there are no weakening of the economies of Europe, no reparations demands on Germany, thus no worldwide Great Depression. America became the great creditor and industrial power because of the collapse of the European economies in the 1920s. Without the war, that doesn't happen. Without the war, there's perhaps no genocide of Armenians in Turkey, no flu epidemic that kills 25 million people. In this country, Herbert Hoover wins re-election in 1932. If he had ever been re-elected or elected in 28, because he made his reputation off World War I. So he's re-elected in 1932. There's no FDR. There is no New Deal. There is no Social Security. There's no World War II. Can we even begin to imagine the impact that war had on our lives? It is virtually impossible to comprehend our lives without it. Without World War II, there is no American involvement on the world stage. No American military, political, and economic colossus that sits astride the world. There might have been no nuclear weapons. Without World War II, there's no communist bloc, so there is no Cold War. There is no GI Bill. Eisenhower isn't president. There's no post-war American economic engine that transformed the world in the 1950s. Makes us the richest, most affluent, most powerful nation in the world. Without World War II, there is no Holocaust. Without the Holocaust, is there a creation of Israel? The Balfour Declaration came out of World War I as well that created Israel. Without an Israel, what did the last 65 years look like? There's no space race with the Soviets. There's no interstate highway system. There's no military-industrial complex, and it was the military that invented the internet in 1969. What happens with that? There's no communist Cuba. there's no Cuban Missile Crisis. Without World War II, there's probably no John F. Kennedy. But even if there is, without a Soviet Union, there's no Lee Harvey Oswald. So there's no LBJ, there's no Great Society, there's no Medicare. There's no civil rights acts that LBJ passes on the strength of John F. Kennedy's death. So civil rights movement, if there is one, looks very different. And is there one? All those black Americans who fought in World War II, who then came home and demanded equality, what happens to that? Our whole conception of individual human rights is different without the Holocaust. Without the Cold War, there's no Vietnam. Now the 1960s look and feel different. There's no war, there's no draft, there's no counterculture. Our arts, our movies, our TV, our music, everything looks and feels different. Without World War II, there's probably no CIA. The Shah of Iran is not put in power, and maybe there's no Islamic Revolution in 1979. Without World War I, there's no Iraq. Without communism, there's no Red Scare. Without a Red Scare, there's no Richard Nixon. There's no Watergate. Now the 70s look different. Without the Cold War, is there a Ronald Reagan? What role does America play in the world now? Is there still an Austro-Hungarian Empire, a Russian Empire? Is the Tsar still on the throne in 2014? What does the Middle East look like? Would there have been a September 11th? All right, so I'm playing what if. There's no doubt other things would have happened, but again, they might not have, and what would have happened might have been worse, might have been better, but the fact is it would have been different. Our world would have been totally, totally different had there never been a First World War. What do we do the next time we're faced with a potentially dangerous incident like the assassination of the Archduke, or the shooting down of an airplane, or the annexation of territory? Do we continue to heed the lessons of 1938 in Munich, the belief that appeasement only makes the aggressor more aggressive, or do we heed the forgotten lessons of 1914? Do we, as Shakespeare said, cry havoc and unleash the dogs of war? Do we still think the Great War is irrelevant? The next time your phone buzzes and you look at it and you see an update on Gaza, or the Ukraine, or Syria, or Crimea, or about an American soldier killed on foreign soil, think about that bullet, about the Archduke's car making a wrong turn. Without even knowing it, you are still every day getting dispatches from the First World War. As we stand on the threshold of this new century, 100 years later, remember Alec Reeder and the 37 million casualties of that war. I think he and they all still matter very much. We forget the lessons that those deaths can teach us and the havoc that war unleashed at our own peril. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stan. On your behalf, we made a donation.